Welcome back to We the People Rediscovered. I'm Alex.
And I'm Ben. Today, we are opening our most controversial case file. It's a debate that explodes after every national tragedy involving a firearm, a debate that divides families, friends, and the nation itself.
It's a debate over just 27 words. And for today's constitutional investigation, we're calling this case the smoking gun. We're going to brush away more than 200 years of political rhetoric to figure out what those 27 words, the words of the Second Amendment, were actually meant to do.
So our dig site begins with the text itself. It reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed."
So right away, the language feels complicated. It's almost like two sentences got smashed together. You have that whole first part about a well-regulated militia,
Right.
and then the second part about the right of the people. So what was the crime the founders were trying to solve here?
The crime they were obsessed with was tyranny, specifically the tyranny of a standing army, a permanent professional army controlled by a central government. To the founders, who just fought a war against the British Redcoats,
Right.
a standing army was the ultimate tool of oppression.
So they didn't trust a national army, but they still had to defend the new country. What was their alternative?
The alternative was the militia. In the 18th century, this essentially meant all able-bodied citizens who were expected to own their own musket and be ready for local defense. The Second Amendment was, at its heart, a compromise. It was designed to prevent the new federal government from ever disarming those citizen-run state militias, which they saw as the people's ultimate check on a potentially tyrannical federal army.
So the original debate wasn't at all about individual self-defense in the way we talk about it today. No, it was a structural argument about military power. A big federal army versus these citizen-run state militias.
Exactly. The entire context was military. And the evidence we find when we dig into the archives, the letters, the pamphlets, the records from state ratification debates,
Wow.
it all points to this. It was a fierce argument about who should have the monopoly on military force.
But it also wasn't the only motive, was it? When we look at the evidence from some of the southern states,
No,
a much darker picture emerges.
it does. For some, especially in the South, there was a secondary and far more sinister concern. They wanted their militias armed to act as slave patrols. They were terrified the federal government might one day try to disarm those patrols and interfere with slavery. So you had multiple, sometimes conflicting motives at play.
Which makes this a very complex cold case. So if the historical context is so clearly about militias and this fear of a standing army,
Right.
how did our modern debate become so intensely focused on an individual's right to own a gun for personal protection?
That, Alex, is the most shocking discovery in this whole investigation. For the first 200 years of American history, the Supreme Court almost never ruled on the Second Amendment.
Really?
It was a constitutional backwater. And on the rare occasions it was mentioned, it was always in the context of militias.
So when did that change? When did the ground completely shift?
The major turning point, the moment everything we think about today began, didn't happen until 2008.
2008. That's incredibly recent.
It's stunningly recent. In a landmark case called District of Columbia versus Heller, the Supreme Court ruled for the first time in American history
Wow.
that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm for self-defense within the home.
In that one moment, the court legally separated the right of the people clause from the militia clause that opens the amendment.
Right.
So the core legal idea that defines our entire modern gun debate, it's newer than the first iPhone. It's not some timeless, original understanding.
No.
It's a modern legal interpretation.
A modern and still very controversial one. The Heller decision rewrote the legal landscape. It did affirm an individual right, but it also stated very clearly that this right is not unlimited. It left the door open for all sorts of regulations, which is why we are still arguing so fiercely about its limits today.
So the smoking gun of our investigation is that both sides of the modern debate are often arguing over a version of the Second Amendment that didn't really exist in the minds of the founders or in the halls of the Supreme Court for most of American history.
Precisely. We are all trapped in a modern argument over a deeply ambiguous 18th century compromise. The founders weren't trying to solve our 21st century problems of mass shootings and urban crime. They were trying to solve their 18th century problem of how to defend a new nation without creating a tyrannical army. They didn't leave us a clear answer. They left us
a riddle that continues to have life and death consequences. And it's our job as citizens to understand that riddle's origin, not just shout about our preferred solution.
Now, here's a question we'd like you to think about. The Second Amendment was born from a deep distrust of a powerful centralized military. Knowing that, how do you think the founders would view our modern world, where we have the most powerful standing army in global history, alongside a heavily armed populace?